Okay, thanks. So this is the central question of our research. What is it that generates moral concern for future generations and commitment to environmental issues? Hannah Watkins was a postdoc working on this project together with me, and we took a two-pronged approach to addressing this. One part of the project was dedicated to conducting lengthy structured interviews with a group of over 50 environmental exemplars. And these were people that had demonstrated a very strong track record of commitment to addressing environmental issues. And we thought that looking at them would be very interesting for understanding the kinds of distinctive attitudes, motivations and values that might underpin their commitment to environmental issues, and that it was a really good test bed for looking at moral excellence more generally. The other thing we did was that, drawing upon those interviews, we conducted follow-up survey and behavioural studies trying to explore the insights and the themes that we gathered through the interviews with non-exemplar subjects. And I'm going to spend most of the time today on that second part, because it's the part that we've sort of advanced the most. But let me just say a little bit about the first parts before I get into that. So we had the goal of interviewing 50 of these environmental exemplars. We ended up with a sample of 56. Now, were people that had demonstrated a very clear track record of commitment to environmental issues, and they had also either won a prominent environmental prize or been nominated by such a prize winner, or they were nominated by a knowledgeable member of an environmental organisation. And they completed these structured interviews, which lasted about 45, 60 minutes, and I'll show you some of the questions we asked in a second. And they also, most of them, not everyone did this, but most of them completed a companion quantitative survey as a follow-up as well. We're currently in the process of completing data collection with a matched group of control subjects for them on that survey. And we're still in the process of finalising the coding of those interviews, which turns out to be quite a laborious, though interesting task. Just to give you a sense of some of the questions we asked them, this is not a complete set by any means, but it's the sort of issues we were looking at. So we looked at things like whether they placed relative priority on the intrinsic or the instrumental value of the natural environment, whether they themselves personally experienced some kind of special connection with nature, whether their work was driven by some connection or salient sense of the importance of future or past generations of people, optimism and pessimism surrounding environmental issues and how they dealt with pessimism around the environment, whether they saw their work as a calling, whether there was a spiritual dimension to their work, and whether they see environmental problems as reflecting the moral failings of humanity. So the answers were interesting. I'm going to focus on two of these questions today because what we learned from the interviews then guided a lot of our subsequent research. So the first of these has to do with what kind of value do they see in the natural environment, and the second one is this idea that environmental problems reflect, in some sense, the moral failings of humanity. So let me start with this question about why to value nature. Why do people value nature, and why should they value nature? So traditionally, there have been two answers given to this question. One is that nature is intrinsically valuable, so it's valuable for its own sake in its own right. And that contrasts with instrumental valuation. So nature is valuable because of what it provides as a resource to humans. And I think the most straightforward way of thinking about this is just the distinction between means and ends. Is the natural environment valuable as an end in itself, or simply because it is a means to some further end? And that distinction is obviously very well trodden in moral philosophy and moral psychology, and it's relevant to a lot of different areas, but it does have special significance, I think, with respect to the environment. There has been existing research in environmental psychology on this question, and it has seemed to provide two sorts of distinctive empirical findings. One is that it seems that the extent to which people value the natural environment intrinsically is a better predictor of relevant environmental attitudes and behaviours as compared with instrumental valuation. So there's a very well-cited paper in the early 90s by Thompson and Barton, and it's been cited over 1,000 times. They use slightly different nomenclature than us, but basically their ecocentric concern measure maps onto intrinsic value. And they found that that outperformed their anthropocentric or instrumental concern measure in predicting things like self-reported environmental behaviour, environmental apathy, that was negatively predicted, and actual environmental behaviour in the study, which was signing up to be part of some environmental organisation. And that sort of idea was shown also in Milfont and Duckett's research, which is also very well cited, They've got yet further nomenclature, but I think it still maps on pretty well to instrumental and intrinsic. And they found that this intrinsic measure better predicted ecological behaviour. So one finding is that it seems as though intrinsic valuation of the environment is somehow preferable in this domain. The other finding is that it looks as though intrinsic and instrumental valuation of nature are either not correlated or they're negatively correlated. So Thompson and Barton found negligible correlations between their measures, but Milfont and Duckett found substantial negative correlations between these two measures. And this finding piqued our interest because it struck us as being highly counterintuitive. Why should the extent to which a person values nature intrinsically be negatively related to the extent to which they value it instrumentally? If you take an example from a non-environmental domain, if you think about, say, a person who values the ruins of the Roman Colosseum intrinsically, it seems like their valuation of that for its own sake is not going to be negatively correlated with the extent to which they value it as a means for advancing human knowledge or something like that. The same thing seemed like it should be true in the environmental domain. So this caught our attention and got us wondering about this question. So one question is, should these constructs be negatively related? And why is it that instrumental valuation is only marginally related to environmental dependent variables of interest? We also thought that was a little peculiar. If you think that nature is valuable instrumentally, that you would think would also predict certain measures of concern. Our environmental exemplars, when we asked them this question, this was sort of instructive because they very often mentioned the instrumental valuation of nature. Some of them prioritised it more than the intrinsic valuation, and many of them mentioned both. And they sort of thought, look, in some ways they didn't really like the question because it was like, look, it's valuable in both of these ways. Let's move on. And so we did. But that was also useful because it sort of told us that they weren't just thinking, well, it's just nature is valuable for its own sake. So when we look back at some of this past research, we observed a few things that we thought were problematic. And one is that some items just don't distinguish between these two constructs. They measure something else, like emotions. Some items are just irrelevant to either construct. That's a related problem. But by far the largest problem is that the measures of instrumental value seem to inherently oppose that kind of valuation with intrinsic valuation. I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. But this looked to us like it could be a possible explanation for why you see this negative correlation. So they do one of two things. One is that they will assert that the instrumental reason is the most important one, thereby implicitly comparing it against some other reason, or they will just flat out assert that the intrinsic reason is not important in a particular item. So this looked like it could be a potential problem that might be worthy of further investigation. Here's Milfont and Duckett's scale. So I'm going to pick on them a little bit here. They have 10 items in each of these scales. I'm just showing you a few. The measures of intrinsic concern, I think, are by and large okay. So I think this one's fine. Nature is valuable for its own sake, and then reverse-coded items along the same lines. It makes me sad to see natural environments destroyed. I think that doesn't really pick out intrinsic as opposed to instrumental valuation, but I can sort of see why they might have bundled emotions in this category. That's a reverse scored emotion item. And then some items are just totally irrelevant to the construct, I think. Humans are still subject to the laws of nature. Let's look at the instrumental one though, because I think this is where the problems arise. This first measure, this one's okay perhaps. Nature is important because of what it can contribute to the pleasure and welfare of humans. But we start to see more opposition as we go through these items. The worst thing about the loss of the rainforest is that it will restrict the development of new medicines. Not one bad thing, but the very worst thing. It's implicitly hierarchical. We should protect the environment for the well-being of plants and animals rather than for the welfare of humans. Okay, now we have this opposition coming in very directly. Human happiness and human reproduction are less important than a healthy planet. I think you get the picture here. This one's perhaps the most egregious. We need to keep rivers and lakes clean in order to protect the environment, and not as places for people to enjoy water sports. So I think that in some ways this negative relationship is almost baked into these scale items. And so we wanted to address this, and we thought it was worth doing so. So what happens when you measure these constructs more accurately? That's one question. Are they negatively correlated? We're going to predict that they'll be positively correlated. A subsequent question was, do they independently predict environmental dependent variables of interest? And then a slightly different question, which I'll explain more about in a second, is do they predict different kinds of environmental dependent variables? Are there sort of selective prediction effects? And then another question I want to ask in this is, are these really the only relevant sources of valuation of the environment? Another thing that our exemplars told us made us question this, and I'll get to that in a second. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 4 studies in this part of the talk. One where we just correct something about these scales, another one where we look at them to predict environmental attitudes, and then 2 further studies where we examine these 2 measures alongside a third measure. All right, so in this first study, we took Milfont and Duckett's items and we simply tried to make as minimal changes as we could to their items to remove this opposition between these 2 modes of value. So what happened, the design was such that the subjects either got the 2 original scales, intrinsic and instrumental, or they got the original intrinsic scale and a subtly reworded version of the instrumental scale. So this is the kind of thing that we did. This is the original scale item. The worst thing about the loss of the environment is that it will restrict the development of new medicines. We just changed that to one bad thing about the loss of the rainforest, is that it will restrict the development of new medicines. This was originally a reverse scored item. Conservation is important even if it lowers people's standard of living. We're opposing sort of instrumental and intrinsic concern. We just made that environmental conservation is important partly because it increases people's standard of living. And then similarly for this last one, we need to keep rivers and lakes clean in order to protect the environment and not to provide places for people to enjoy water sports. We just asserted that both of those reasons were important. This is not an exhaustive list of changes, but it's just illustrating the kinds of things we did. I definitely think this last item is still far from ideal. It's a double-barreled item, but nonetheless, we wanted to make minimal changes in this first study. So we had 100 undergrads here. They completed the scales in the design that I illustrated. The reliabilities are okay, not perfect. We replicated the original finding that with the original scales, there's a negative correlation between intrinsic valuation and instrumental valuation, but in our other group with the reworded scale, we now see a positive correlation. And so there's a substantial difference between those correlations, even with relatively subtle rewordings of the instrumental value scale. So we would argue this makes a lot more sense and is probably a better way to measure instrumental valuation. What we then turn to is, how do these constructs predict variables of interest? And so we ran a few studies on this. I'm just showing you one of them here. So one thing we did in this study is we took 5 very well-known and venerated natural areas, the Grand Canyon, the Great Barrier Reef, and so on. And part of the design, and you'll see why this was relevant in a second, is that we either framed those natural areas in terms of properties that are relevant to their intrinsic value, or alternatively, in another condition, in terms of properties that are relevant to their instrumental value. So that was an experimental manipulation. We asked subjects to complete those reworded scales of intrinsic and instrumental valuation. And so one question we can ask is, do these scales independently predict responses to hypothetical environmental destruction? The past research has suggested it's really all about intrinsic valuation, but that might be because instrumental valuation has been poorly measured. Second question is, do they differentially predict responses? And this is where the framing manipulation came in. So the thought here was, scores on the intrinsic valuation scale are going to especially predict responses when you frame those natural areas in terms of their intrinsic value, and vice versa, scores on the instrumental value scale are going to especially predict responses when they're framed in terms of their instrumental value. So that's not a jaw-dropping prediction. If we found evidence for that, it would make sense. But at the same time, it would, I think, help show something about the relative utility, something further about the utility of measuring these constructs. As it turned out, we didn't find any evidence for that second part. So here's what the study looked like. Subjects were presented with images and text descriptions. This is the intrinsic framing condition. And the main points of this are just that the description makes little reference to humanity or humans and is instead referring to the physical grandeur, the enormity, the ancientness of the Grand Canyon. So it's emphasizing things that should be relevant to its intrinsic value. In the instrumental case, different picture, this time with a human in the Grand Canyon, and the description is really accentuating what you can do in the Grand Canyon, what people can derive from it. As it turns out, this framing manipulation really made little difference. Okay, so this is what we asked people. How upset would you be if this was destroyed by human action? How much would you personally be willing to sacrifice to help preserve this area? How bad would it be if this were destroyed? And to what extent would you oppose or support a costly policy to protect this area? These things correlated very well together, so we're just averaging them together into an overall index of concern for this area. Okay, so what I'm going to show you here is regression results. Here I'm collapsing across all 5 entities. The results are very similar if you just treat them each as independent dependent variables or stimuli. Okay, so here are our regression coefficients in a simultaneous regression. And the first thing to note here is this finding here, which is that both intrinsic valuation and instrumental valuation are independently predicting variance in people's concern for these natural areas. This is noteworthy because past research has seemingly suggested that it's just intrinsic value that matters. But you can see they're of comparable strengths in this study. So there is evidence for independent predictive value of these 2 measures, and that's a new finding. But there's no evidence, however, for selective prediction. So what we would have expected here is these two-way interactions, such that scores on the intrinsic valuation scale are going to especially predict responses in the intrinsic condition and vice versa for instrumental value. That would have resulted in two-way interactions and a further 3-way interaction in ideal conditions. But you can see that there's really no trace of those interactions at all. So we don't see evidence for selective prediction here. But I still think the finding of independent prediction is important. Okay, so that's a finding that contrasts with prior literature. But the failure of that second prediction did cause us to step back and think a little bit. And it did so in concert with some of the exemplars' responses when we posed this question about intrinsic and instrumental valuation. Because one of the things they said ended up being very hard to categorize in terms of either intrinsic or instrumental value. So they would often refer to things like, in response to a question about what they got from nature or how they saw its value, they would start referring to things that I think of more as the psychological or spiritual value of nature. It's time in nature offers a time for contemplation, for refuge, for connecting to something greater than oneself. Some people referenced relaxation. When you think about, okay, well, is that referencing the intrinsic or the instrumental value? On the one hand, it seems like it's drawing attention to properties of nature that are intrinsically valuable, but it's also explicitly referencing the human experience of those properties. So it's sort of a hybrid form of value which can't neatly be categorized as either intrinsic or instrumental value. I think it's a kind of instrumental value, but it's a very different sort of instrumental value than is typically discussed in this literature, where nature is conceived of as a resource or a utility for human consumption. It's not being seen in that way. So that made us think, okay, why don't we try to measure this third form of value, since it seems so prominent in many of our exemplars. So that's what we did in this third study. We wanted to come up with 3 scales now: intrinsic, what I'm calling psychological, and instrumental value. And we also said, okay, let's throw off the shackles here. We've been trying to stick with the original scale wordings in measuring these things. Let's not do that. They're not that great in the first place. Let's try to come up with measures that we think are more ideal at measuring these different constructs. So this is what we did. We came up with 6 item scales for each of these constructs. This is our new intrinsic value scale. And these items make reference to the value of nature in its own right, independent of human interest. And I think they do so more directly than at least some of the items in the original scale. And it's noteworthy that the alpha is considerably higher than for the original scale. Our functional instrumental value drew upon the old scale, but it used slightly different and I think more straightforward wordings. It made reference to the general resource value of nature for human survival and welfare. And again, the scale reliability is considerably higher. And then the third scale, which drew very heavily upon the exemplar responses and the kinds of things they expressed to us, made reference to things like nature as a source of awe and wonder, as a source of beauty, as a source of transcendence, as a source of contemplation, connection to something greater than oneself, all getting at this idea of psychological value. And that scale reliability is pretty good as well. Okay, so once we've got those, then the question was, how do they predict attitudes of interest? And so we measured 4 well-known, well-established attitudes in this area: willingness to sacrifice for the environment, self-reports of conservation behaviour, environmental movement activism, which is your willingness to join an environmental movement, and then support for climate change policies. So what I'm just going to go through quickly here is regression results where we're predicting those dependent variables from these 3 scales. And the results were fairly consistent and interesting. First of all, here are just the correlations between the scales. They're all quite highly positively correlated, but not perfectly, obviously. In terms of willingness to sacrifice for the environment, we found that it was the intrinsic value scale and the psychological value scale that independently predicted variance in that construct. Same was true for personal conservation behaviour. It was intrinsic and psychological valuation. And then the same was also true for environmental movement activism. So quite consistent results across 3 different kinds of dependent variables. The only one that didn't show that pattern, which surprised us to some extent, was climate policy support. This one, I think, would be the one that would be the best candidate for instrumental value predicting people's responses, but in fact it was just intrinsic value in this particular case. So that was a little bit confounding. In any case, I think what these results do show is that there is some utility in measuring this kind of psychological value, which is distinct from intrinsic and instrumental. Our next study then in this sequence followed that up further. We wanted to do very much the same exercise, but this time using dependent variables that are a little bit more symbolic and that get more at people's felt sense of connection to or relationship with nature. So one item we used here was the commitment to nature scale, which was developed in the 2000s. I quite like this scale for reasons I'll get into in a second. We used this nature and selves task, which was developed by Schultz. And then we came up with a couple of new measures in this study as well, which I'll show you. So the commitment to nature scale, I like this because the items are really straightforward and I think they're very easy to answer, and they just kind of straightforwardly assess this idea of attachment to and commitment to nature. So it's comprised of 11 different items. That's one dependent variable. The self in nature task is a pictograph task, and the other 2 tasks are also pictographs. This was developed by Schultz, who developed it from Aaron. The original task is the self in other task. And basically the idea is the closer together these 2 circles are, the more it represents inclusion of the self in nature. So how sort of close to or included within nature you feel. Inspired by that, we came up with a couple of other measures as well. One of them was this self-nature distance task. It's quite similar to the inclusion task, another pictograph task where you're asked to indicate how close do you feel to nature, and you could pick a distant response or a closer response. And then finally, we had a different task which was not about the self but more about humans, which was this human nature hierarchy pictograph. And there was more explanatory text, but basically subjects were told that this response indicates that humans are seen as more important than nature. This one is that humans are much less important than nature. Notice this is about humanity in general, not the self. And so subjects could pick one of those responses. So then the question for us was, how do these 3 psychological constructs predict these responses? And the results overall, I think, have a consistency with what we saw in the previous study, because they show, I think, the value of measuring psychological value. So these are the correlations between the 3 scales, very similar to the previous study, different group of subjects. And here are regression results again. In terms of commitment to nature, we're seeing intrinsic value and psychological value independently predicting variance. Instrumental value does not, once you control for those other forms of value. In terms of the self in nature task, we see that it's psychological value that seems to be doing the most work here in predicting variance. Same is true for self-nature distance, which is obviously quite a similar task to the circles task. So once again, we're seeing psychological value be quite prominent here. And then the last dependent variable had a slightly different pattern. This is human nature hierarchy. What these results mean is the more people valued nature intrinsically, the more importance they accorded nature. I think that makes sense relative to humans. The reverse was true for functional instrumental value. That's a little bit of a regression artifact though, because the raw correlation is 0. It only becomes a negative once you control for the other forms of value. Okay, so that's basically all I wanted to say on that particular project, other than just wrapping up some conclusions here. We would argue that the way people value nature has been studied in a somewhat biased way, and that past attempts to do so have exaggerated the opposition between intrinsic and instrumental value. We find that instrumental value is quite important in some contexts in predicting responses. It was also nominated frequently by our exemplars. But there's also a suggestion in these last studies that there's another form of value which really did come out of the interviews with the exemplars that may actually be the most important form of instrumental value, which is this kind of psychological value. Okay, now I know I'm running out of time, but I did want to just introduce one further idea today. And if I can do it in 5 minutes, I'll be doing well. So this is a question about how environmental problems arose. So I'll just kind of sketch out the idea, show you a couple of results, and then maybe we can talk further about it. This question, again, was prompted by what our exemplars told us. We had not originally planned to ask them about this, but in some of the early interviews with them, a very distinctive theme emerged from some of the exemplars, which is that environmental problems fundamentally reflect the moral failings of humanity, especially greed, consumerism, and materialism. And that got us thinking, oh, that's quite an interesting idea. So we started to continue to ask the exemplars about that question. But then we also wanted to run some studies looking at this idea in non-exemplar subjects. And so that's what we've done. And let me just show you a couple of illustrative quotes from our exemplars. I'll just present those quickly. This one is mentioning consumption, buying and acquiring things, greed, and this one down here about accumulation and greed. Now, it certainly wasn't the case that all of our exemplars said this. In fact, I would say it wasn't the majority of them, but it was enough of them, and it was such an interesting idea that we thought it warranted further follow-up. So our question then is, does this belief in moral failings as underlying environmental issues predict environmentally relevant behaviours and attitudes in a unique way that can't be done through existing measures? So we've worked on developing a moral failings scale. There's a bunch of studies that pertain to the development of that scale that I'm just going to skip right over. And I want to show you a couple of results using that scale. So we made 3 predictions about this that we've been exploring. One is that a belief in moral failings is going to predict support for population control, and even in the extreme case, support for a somewhat fringe but very provocative idea about voluntary human extinction, which has been advocated by some. Prediction 2 is this idea that a belief in moral failings is going to predict relative preference for restrictive or curtailment solutions to environmental problems relative to technological solutions. And I'm just, in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip over prediction 3. So here are some illustrative scale items from this scale. They tap into ignorance, greed, and moral failings generally expressed. It's arguably a bit of a misnomer to call that a moral failing, but in any case, it's a human failing of some sort. That's what these items look like. Surprisingly, among lay subjects, there's quite a bit of endorsement for these sorts of ideas. I had thought that there wouldn't be, but there in fact was. Okay, so one study, we looked at people's support for population control. We described this thing called the voluntary human extinction movement. This is a radical ecological movement which argues that we should stop reproducing for the sake of the environment, and its slogan is, I think, live long and die out. So we presented the text of this, and we asked questions like, sorry, before I get into the measures, the basic logic here is, if you think environmental problems fundamentally reflect a core human failing, then you're going to be more attracted to the idea that, well, we should probably just limit or in fact get rid of humans entirely. That's the idea. So we looked at a bunch of different dependent variables, the appeal of this movement, judgment of a friend who joins this movement, agreement with its tenets, support for more moderate population control, as well as beliefs about the immorality of having children. Okay, and basically what we found, these are distinct regressions. The moral failing scale strongly predicted each of those dependent variables with demographic controls and also controls for green identity, which is a measure of environmental consciousness, and also general human misanthropy, the extent to which you don't like people. Moral failings predicts that better than does misanthropy. Okay, so I know I've run out of time here, but I'll just sketch this result. I think this is an interesting one. Basically, what we're looking at here is belief in moral failings is going to predict relative support for curtailment solutions rather than technological solutions. The idea is a curtailment solution, one which advocates for the restriction in human consumption, addresses the core moral failing at the heart of an environmental issue. But a technological solution doesn't. It essentially bypasses that moral failing. So it's going to seem relatively less satisfying to somebody who highly endorses this moral failings belief. We found some support for that. We asked people to make judgments of responses to climate change, 2 of which were described as curtailment. So this was carbon pricing and enforceable limits on consumption, 2 of which were technological. These were carbon scrubbing, where you scrub carbon out of the atmosphere, and albedo modification, which is pumping gases into clouds to deflect sunlight. And the descriptions of these technologies emphasize their restrictive or their non-restrictive properties. I'll just skip over these additional judgments. This was just a manipulation check and a purported mediator. This is what the enforceable limits description looked like. This is just an excerpt. You can see that it is emphasizing the curtailment of human consumption, whereas the carbon scrubbing one did not make such an emphasis, and in fact explicitly said, look, this is not really going to have that much of an impact on consumption. So what we found is these are some additional controls. This is just our manipulation check. The curtailment solutions were indeed seen as more restrictive of consumption. But also we found that the moral failings belief more strongly correlated with the curtailment solutions. So low correlations with support for the technological solutions, much higher correlations with support for the curtailment solutions. And then the final analysis that I'm going to present here, we're doing regressions where we're predicting people's relative preference for the curtailment over the technological solution using moral failings as a predictor. And you can see it does well and independently predicts that, even when you include demographic controls and green environmental consciousness controls. So it seems to be adding something new. And that's an analysis with our purported mediator, which is how well the solution addresses the fundamental cause. And it's suggestive of partial mediation. Okay, so I should wrap up. I'm just going to skip over that. I think you've got the general idea from moral failings. But just standing back from the whole project, we investigated environmental exemplars, and doing so is interesting in its own right, but it also suggested these 3 ideas which we followed up and found support for. Intrinsic and instrumental valuation are positively related. There's this other form of valuation, psychological valuation of the environment, that stands apart from both of them and that predicts variables of interest. And this idea that environmental problems reflect moral failings does seem to be a meaningful measure which is separate from existing measures and which predicts responses of interest. So we have more to come, including focused analyses of the exemplars themselves. We're just not quite completed with that part. But that's the end. Thank you for your attention, and thanks very much for the support for the project. It's been a lot of fun, very interesting to work on. So thank you, and look forward to questions.
Thanks, that's really interesting. This is a very small philosophical request. I really like this identification of what you're calling a psychological dimension. Could you perhaps avoid calling it instrumental? And the reason is that instrumental suggests that there's some other end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what's notable about this category is that the goodness comes from the goodness of nature, or at least it might do that. It leaves it open that the thought is nature's intrinsically good.
Yeah.
Because it's intrinsically good, it has these beneficial effects.
Right.
And it not calling it instrumental doesn't it avoids putting it on a par with well, look, some people to feel better, they go clubbing. Me, to feel better, I go on a hike. And it's like, that's just what I do to feel better. Now, maybe some people engage in it that way, but you wouldn't want to assume that that's what's going on. If you just, I liked the title, psychological, that suffices.
Yeah, I'm not at all wedded to that. I guess the reason we were thinking of it as instrumental is because it's valuable in that sense because it produces a kind of psychological experience. But I get your point that people who endorse that may not actually be thinking of it in that instrumental way. So yeah, I'm totally happy with that.
Well, I love the third construct you made. So when I was seeing the first two, I was sort of thinking something's missing. And you got it. So awesome. And I kind of wanted to follow up on that because I do have trouble understanding what that intrinsic value of nature is supposed to refer to.
Yeah.
I can get it with the animals. That makes sense to me. There's some intrinsic value of the animals in nature.
Yeah.
I have trouble understanding what the thing is that's being referred to as have an intrinsic value, other than the animals. In particular, if you have interest in nature and the awe of nature, you recognize that the current form of our environment on our planet is very odd. Right, and it's very unusual for the history of our planet. It's not clear why this particular form of the environment is better than any other intrinsically. And so I'm not sure what's being referred to. Is it the one that we live in, or is it the whole historical process? Most of the history of the Earth is rocks and lava, right? So, or sponges, right? The biggest biomass ever for the longest period of time was sponges. So I'm just a little unclear. What is that referring to? Maybe you could help me understand that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the sense of it is that it's referring to that part of nature which is sort of, as far as possible, untrammeled by human existence. That there's something about the originality or the authenticity of nature is separate from humans that it's referring to. I take your point that there are parts of nature that seem relatively uninteresting and that are going to be less likely to give rise to that sense of intrinsic value. But yeah, that's not an entirely satisfying answer. The only other thing I would say is that there is this famous philosophical thought experiment called the last person experiment by this guy Richard Sylvan. And he asked the reader to contemplate, imagine you're the last person in existence and you have this button that can, if you press the button, it will basically destroy all of the rest of the existing natural wilderness that exists. Would you press that button? And the thought about this was, look, if all you are concerned about is human welfare and human interest, or even the welfare of sentient beings, there's nothing wrong with destroying just purely natural environments. But I think most people, or maybe I'm wrong about this, but at least some people find that sort of abhorrent, and that there's some residual value independent of how it relates to human experience. Now, that doesn't really answer, well, hang on, what bits of it, which I think is what you're getting at.
That's interesting. Yeah, I guess I would agree with that button, not wanting to press that button. Yeah. But I still don't understand why the wilderness, the current kinds of forests that exist on the Earth are sort of more special than the kinds of forests that existed for longer.
But I don't think you have to assert that if you're going to say that the environment has intrinsic value now. You might even think, look, it's been losing value because of the amount of human intrusion, but still valuable in some intrinsic sense. I don't think it implies that comparison. I think it just, what comparison it does imply is a good question. I don't know exactly.
If people read those items like I might be tempted to, when I see nature, I mean the universe.
Yeah.
It's not
universe.
It's not tied to Earth. Like everything in natural existence, which includes everything.
Yeah, so this relates to Amber's question earlier. John O'Neill has a paper where he distinguishes between different kinds of intrinsic value, and it looks like that might help in your distinction. So one is what he refers to as non-instrumental value, which is something we value not because it leads to something else. So like pleasure, for example, we value for its own sake, not because it leads to something else. And then another is objective value, so something that could have value even in the absence of any humans around to value it. And it looks like perhaps what you're calling intrinsic value might relate more to the objective value And what you're calling psychological value could perhaps, or at least some of those things could perhaps be this more non-instrumental value.
Sorry, what's that last phrase?
More the non-instrumental version of
Right.
intrinsic value rather than
Right.
the objective
Right.
version.
Okay, so the distinction is
Just
objective versus non-instrumental.
So
Right.
there's people use intrinsic value to mean different things.
Yeah.
One is non-instrumental,
Yeah.
and one is something that could be valued or that would have value even in the absence of anyone around to value that.
Great. Yeah, no, that does sound quite in line with what we've been doing. I'm not aware of that, so I definitely have to check that out. Thanks.
In general, I totally appreciate that you try to take the whole moral and especially moral sectional discussion to the environmental area, because I think that's really the blind spot for psychologists. They often stop the point where where moral involves caring about other people and not about animals or environment.
Yeah.
My question is more with regard to the statistical approach. I wondered when you show that the new scales are positively correlated to each other, and I wonder what the part is that is left in the regression models when they are put in together and the shared variance is kind of taken out. So I would be really interested if the pattern results that you presented are also present for bivariate.
Yeah. Yeah, so by and large, they are in form, but not in terms of magnitude. So a lot of the time I presented results where it was the intrinsic and the psychological scale that were independently predicting variance. By and large, that mapped onto cases where the raw correlations for those two variables were the highest and relatively equal. The raw correlation for instrumental value was lower, still significant, around sort of 0.2. But then in the regression, when you've got the accounting for the shared variance, it just pops out as a predictor. But it's not that it's totally unimportant. There were some cases where there were arguably artifacts, and like the one that I pointed out. But by and large, those results reflected the form of the bivariate correlations, if not the magnitude. Yeah.
If someone else wants to go, I can always ask Geoff. Okay, so great talk. I'm just curious if you thought about ways that we could increase these two values that people have, and if you think one is maybe more malleable than the other.
Yeah. We tried before we came to the idea of psychological value, we tried about 5 studies to experimentally manipulate intrinsic and instrumental value. We couldn't get any of those studies to affect our manipulation check. So we did all kinds of things like write a children's story that accentuates either the intrinsic or the instrumental value of nature. We sort of threw the usual tricks at this, and we couldn't manipulate that. Whether you can manipulate psychological value, I don't know, we haven't tried, but obviously it'd be ideal if we could get experimental control over those things. We're just in the process of developing a manipulation for moral failings, because I think that may be susceptible to experimental manipulation. I'm perhaps foolishly optimistic that we're going to have better luck with that. But if you have any ideas about how one might do that, I'd be very open to hearing them.
On that, I mean, what occurs to me of your 3 forms is that the psychological is experiential. That is, I can confirm it through experience that this thing brings me that value in a much more direct way than I can confirm that there's intrinsic value to nature, or that humans are better off. Yeah, that's very abstract. And yeah, we need trees to make paper and all that, right? but I can directly experience. You show me a scene, and I can experience the psychological value of nature immediately. And I wonder if that.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's great. I hadn't thought of that, but yeah. Okay, maybe yeah.
Just show a scene. I mean, just show that Grand Canyon pit, right? I mean,
Right. Yeah, no, that's good. Yes.
Tagging on with the past 2 comments, though, it might be, as you extend this, if you're intending to look at the relation between certain sorts of environmental attitudes or global beliefs about their environment, including the sort of psychological value that you're discussing, and appropriate attitudes or appropriate ways of going about, I'll just say taking care of the environment. Because some of the things that came up there, the Grand Canyon and so forth, they're striking and they appeal to our psyche. But the Appalachian Mountains have many times the biodiversity of the Western Mountains. I'm not saying this is a parochial person from the West Coast, but it's so. In a way, if you're committed to the environment, the commitments, if you have a commitment of a certain sort, how you work with those are ways that might very much actually contradict or fly in the face of the psychological response that we have to certain sort of beautiful. And to extend it, it could be that bacteria in soil and really gross stuff is more important in the environment than the kind of stuff that lifts our spirits. But to go back to this, what might be useful is to see what sort of things the proper sort of attitudes towards.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that point. I mean, I think you're totally right that it's not always the most vivid or appealing forms of nature that are in fact valuable. And I guess the other point that this makes me think of is, although the moral failings belief, this is slightly tangential, but the moral failings belief was expressed by some of the exemplars, it seems to lead to some consequences, or at least predict certain things that you might not regard as ideal. Like why you wouldn't want to reject a technological solution to environmental problems if it is indeed, in the long run, more beneficial. So I think there's this interesting tension here about trying to wrestle with, well, what really is the most normatively appropriate response. And I'm certainly open to the possibility that some of our exemplars, or at least some of the attitudes that some of them expressed, may not be predictive of the most optimal responses. Yeah.
Yeah, that's another thing that I think just was great insight, this whole business of it reflects moral failing. I think that's something I don't think other people have noticed. That's really was great insight. And it'd be interesting to see exactly what you just said, see what the emotional reaction is of such people to certainly tell them that turns out we're 3 years away from having a perfectly viable technological solution. Would they be sad? Would they be like, oh no, we can't punish people? Or would they be relieved? Like, oh good, now we don't have, now it's not a moral failing anymore, I wonder if there might be a little sadness.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That the solution is here technologically.
Yeah.
But we don't have to restrict our greed or our...
That's a great idea,
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of doing that, but I like it.
Can I sort of follow on from that? Because the way that you presented it was that people sort of think it lets humanity off the hook, that's the underlying reasoning.
Yeah.
But certainly another perfectly viable underlying reasoning is every single technological solution to anything we have ever found anywhere in the whole course of humanity has had worse knock-on effects that we didn't anticipate. Why on earth should I think that this one's going to be different? Right. So that's not moral. And so you'd have to think about how to isolate that moralizing response from the, let's just look at the history of the thing, people.
Yeah. Agreed.
All right, so we're at time for this session. Let's thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.